Hello and welcome to another episode of Ma'na. Today I have a special guest. I'm pleased to be joined by Mark Sedgwick, who's a professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Aarhus University. He has written several books on Western Sufism and modernity. And today he's also the convener of the European Network for the Study of Islam and Esotericism, and also the chair of the Nordic Society for Middle Eastern Studies. Welcome.
Ex-chair.
Ex-chair?
Yes.
So you're no longer...
I'm no longer. I passed it on to somebody else last summer.
But we had the pleasure of actually joining you in Oslo.
It was my pleasure.
Yeah, and it was a very interesting program, to say the least, seeing the whole development of Islamic studies, in the region, in Scandinavia. And it had a lot of different programs. I mean, me and my co-host Amin and Thar was also there. And we tried to really just to enjoy all of the different programs. We divided ourselves. So I needed to go to one and then give feedback. And Amin wanted to join another one. But it was... very interesting, to say the least.
Glad to hear it.
And Mark, maybe if you can start by telling us what actually made you interested in the themes of Western Sufism. You have these personalities like René Guénon, and the whole modernity and the counter-history of modernity. What made you go into that whole intersection?
Well, it was apparently accidental. It started when I was doing my PhD, and I was doing my PhD on the history of a Sufi tariqa, which started off in the Hijaz and over the following 2 centuries spread around the world. And whilst I was doing this, I just happened to be having a conversation with an Italian scholar during a break in a conference. And she said, "So what are you doing?" So I told her, and she said, and I mentioned the name of the tariqa that I was working on, which was the Ahmadiyya Idrisiyya, which isn't that widely known. And she said, "We have a branch of the Ahmadiyya Idrisiyya in Milan." And I thought, this is completely crazy. But in those days, it was relatively easy to get from Cairo, where I was living, to Milan. There was a short flight on Alitalia. So I went and spent a week there. And I met the guy who ran this branch in Milan. He was called Sheikh Abdul Wahid Paravicini.
So not Abdul Wahid Yahya.
Not Abdul Wahid Yahya, but indeed his name was inspired by the name of Abdul Wahid Yahya, who you've previously mentioned. That's to say, René Guénon. And Sheikh Abdul Wahid gave me a short biography of Guénon, which was really all that existed at that time. And after I'd finished in Milan, I was reading that book on the train, going on to my next destination, and I found it absolutely fascinating. So that's how I got interested in it, quite by chance. But of course, things don't really happen by chance, not just metaphysically, but also in the sense that I found that whenever I mentioned anything to do with this, people were really interested. So I thought, well, if people are interested, this is another good reason. I'm interested, other people are interested, so this is a good reason to do some work on it.
And at what point did you realize that there was a whole secret history that lied beneath modernity itself?
Well, I mean, you're referring there to the subtitle of the first book I did on this, which was Against the Modern World.
Yeah.
And then the subtitle was A Secret Intellectual History of the 20th Century. And that subtitle, in fact, came from a an email I was discussing with my publisher at Oxford University Press in New York, and I don't know what it was I discovered was I'd said, and now I've discovered yet another, and I wrote, sometimes it feels like I'm uncovering the secret intellectual history of the 20th century.
Yes.
And she wrote back and said, that should be your subtitle. So that's how
that's an interesting backstory. Can you maybe put some words or try to define some of these terms? I mean, when you speak about modernity, what did René Guénon or other traditionalists and maybe even define traditionalism in
well,
itself?
I mean, we've actually got two terms to define at more or less the same time. One of them is modernity, and the other one is tradition. And they are defined by Guénon and his followers in opposition to each other. So if we start with tradition, which is possibly the easiest one, or certainly for Guénon the most central one, by tradition, he does not mean what most of us mean by tradition. And this is one of the things that makes Guénon a bit difficult, that he tends to make up his own words and use them in his sense, ignoring what they mean for everybody else. For many people, tradition just means old-fashioned. I'm wearing a jacket. That might be a bit traditional. But for Guénon, it didn't mean that at all. He referred to what he called the primordial tradition. And the important word there is actually perhaps primordial, not tradition. Because for him, the primordial tradition was something that had been known to humanity since the very, very beginning. And this is what he later developed the idea of this primordial tradition as being esoteric as opposed to exoteric. And that's the other crucial part. Traditional modernity, esoteric, exoteric. And if we put that in contemporary Western terms, the churches are exoteric.
The external.
It's external, precisely. It's the whole hierarchy and institutions, and also the rules. So if we put it in Islamic terms, the Sharia is exoteric.
What's the esoteric then? Haqiqa?
The esoteric is the road that leads us to the haqiqa, once again putting in Islamic terms, which Guénon tended not to put things in Islamic terms in his writings, but he did in his personal life, and he went off on the search for the haqiqa. So the primordial tradition is esoteric. We could call it mystical, but Guénon wouldn't have done so because he had his own special meaning for the word mystical, typically. But for most of us, we would call that the esoteric, we would call it mystical. So that is how he defined the tradition, primordial and esoteric. Modernity he then defined as the loss of tradition. And this is a central aspect of his thought, that whilst many people believe in progress, Guénon insisted that the fundamental direction of historical development was decline. So we have a decline from a first age where the primordial tradition is known to everybody and things are structured around the primordial tradition. We have a steady decline until we get to today, or actually to Paris in about 1915 in his case, where knowledge of the tradition has been lost, and into the vacuum created by the loss of the tradition comes all sorts of weird ideas that we associate with modernity.
And what are these ideas? Because when we speak about modernity, is it the stripping away of the spirit from materialism? I mean, is it a...
Materialism is certainly one aspect of it, and one of Guénon's best-known books was called The Reign of Quantity. So it's a shift from quality to quantity. It's materialism. it's the idea that the natural sciences can provide meaningful answers to important questions. He's perfectly happy for the natural sciences to provide electricity so that you can read a few more books at night.
Yeah.
But the idea that these sciences, natural sciences, technical sciences, can answer any meaningful questions is something ridiculous. There are a couple more, and here it begins to get slightly controversial. There are a couple more nonsensical modern illusions. One of them is the idea of human equality, and the other is the idea of democracy. Now, Guénon himself wasn't political, but those are two ideas with pretty big political implications.
And his context is, of course, being, experiencing the world wars. So him coming out of the Second World War, and now there is a universalism of creating, is it the human rights? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, I mean, in fact, he was for him, the crucial war was the First World War, I think. Okay. Because he was a young man then. He spent the Second World War in Cairo, so he wasn't touched by it in the same way that people in the West were. But certainly, I mean, the First World War sort of showed that he was right. That, as far as he was concerned, I mean, a lot of people had to rethink things as a consequence of the First World War, as we know. I mean, the idea of progress took a big hit from the First World War, which was hardly a progressive event, except in terms of military technologies. So that was something which he'd been saying before the First World War that modernity had a big problem, and that the decline was coming to the end of time and the new start of a new temporal cycle, he thought.
Yeah. And taking us, on this cyclical time, because we know a lot of these philosophers and mystics actually believed in a cyclical time. I mean, Henry Corbin actually wrote on Ismailism on the cyclical time. And you also spoke in about the Kali Yuga of Hinduism, right?
Yes.
As if it's the last phase where there is a decline in virtue and righteousness, and as if the human civilization is actually progressing towards its own destruction.
Yeah. And I mean, we've got two elements there. One of them is the idea of a succession of ages, which in the Vedantic Hindu version culminates in the Kali Yuga as the fourth age. But there's also a Western system of a golden age, a silver age, an iron age, etc. The difference between the Western series of ages and the Hindu series of ages is that the Hindu series of ages, you start a new cycle. So it's a more optimistic system, perhaps you could say, the Hindu system.
No, it's just very interesting. I remember writing a blog about Adam, and there is some hadith which the Shia Urafa and the Sufis use, is that there was 1,000 Adams before Adam, which actually opens up the whole discussion of how many cycles have we been through. And this is a question which many philosophers and mystics have actually engaged with, the whole cyclical time. And I mean, Guénon must have identified that in his time and his context, as if we are having this progression, whether it's the political technology or the sciences, and but I mean, do they kind of contradict each other? Can I not be an advocate for scientific progress, but at the same time not wanting virtues and the morality to also degenerate?
I mean, in an ideal world, yes. I mean, I think Guénon would have responded to that that although there's absolutely nothing wrong with technical progress and scientific
Going
progress.
to the dentist and fixing your teeth.
Yeah, that is indeed one of the things that I have said, that I would prefer to be in the modern age when I go to the dentist. So there's good stuff like anesthetics when you go to the dentist, and but there's bad stuff. And the bad stuff is the temptation for people to say, okay, that's it. We now understand. We have the material explanation. That's the end of the question. So I think for Guénon, I don't know what he thought about his dentist, but for him in general, the negative consequences of scientific and technical progress outweighed the positive consequences.
And now, I mean, in connection with René Guénon as a French intellectual, we have another personality, which is Henry Corbin. And he's also a very interesting figure in his own, speaking about the cyclical times. And he was more successful on the academic side than Guénon, you could say.
Yes.
And he also was very influenced by the whole Eranos circle and the Perennialism, and you had the whole Theosophical society in connection with that. Can you maybe speak a little bit about him and that connection?
Yeah, well, I mean, Corbin, as you say, is very closely associated with Eranos, which is a fascinating phenomenon, which comes later than the Theosophical society, and has a different character and different effects. I mean, if we take it historically, the Theosophical Society was the first major global alternative religious perennialist association, and it grew and grew, and it was enormous, and it got a bit, what shall we say politely, it got a bit fluffy at the edges. You could, you read some of the Theosophical writings and you think, but this is ridiculous. And Guénon actually reacted against that, because he had, as a young man, been sort of close to those circles, but he somehow realized that a lot of this stuff was, made up. And in reaction against that, he insisted on authenticity, and he also insisted on authentic transmission. So actually, from a history of ideas perspective, you have to look at where, not just what the idea is, but you have to look at where it comes from, which is a pretty good methodological approach to things. Anyhow, so we've got the Theosophical Society, which is not that rigorous, frankly. It's very universalist, and for a period it's extremely influential, and then things begin to go a bit wrong, and the decline of the Theosophical Society is a long story, but it declines.
But people accuse them of actually being reductionist, watering down traditions for their own agenda, right?
Yeah, or adapting the traditions, and I mean the Theosophical approach to Buddhism, which was to say that the Buddhists didn't really understand Buddhism properly. This methodologically, I mean, there are some problems with that approach, and also there were scandals and trickery and letters materializing, and all sorts of
also the dark side of because they also speak about, they also have an occult element in the Theosophy.
Depending slightly what we mean by occult, but yes. So anyhow, that's the Theosophist, which is very much a late 19th century movement, and not terribly rigorous. Whereas Eranos is a 20th century phenomenon and is a lot more rigorous. So the actors, the chief actors at Eranos were all scholars like Corbin, Gershom Scholem, Carl Jung, Eliade was there. I mean, so these are people who were rigorous in their thought and in their methods.
Yeah.
And I mean, in some ways, it was just another academic conference where scholars could exchange ideas with each other, but it also had an agenda, and the agenda was to restore some sort of spiritual content to modern civilization, which all the participants saw as lacking in the spiritual. So here, I mean, this is the same as Guénon and traditionalists, and the number of people who say, well, modernity is all about the material and not about the spiritual. That's a very standard position. And if we take that one the other way around, of course, and people look at the Orient and say, oh, it's spiritual, there's no materialism. I mean, I'm not sure, as somebody who spent some years living in the Middle East, that it's really true that nobody is materialistic.
You'll find those types everywhere. Okay, and what's the correlation between, because I mean there is a project of, we see the New Age movement, which is an effect of the Theosophical Society. Would you say that?
It is and it isn't. I mean, certainly a lot of the thought that we identify with the New Age is taken from Theosophy. So in that sense, yes, it is an effect. But the New Age, I mean, as people talk about the New Age movement and about the New Age. And I think it's helpful to think about it in terms of the New Age. So what was this age? And the answer, there are two answers to that. One of them is that there was an idea that we were moving into a new...
higher consciousness?
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, a new age, a new... I'm hesitating about what adjective I should use here. Frankly, a new astrological age, I think, is probably the best. The age of Aquarius. Yeah. And that was going to be, everything was going to be nice with high consciousnesses and things like that. So the New Age is understood, or was understood, by the people who were trying to welcome it in as a new astrological age when all sorts of things were going to be different. But it's also an age, a time period, in the sense that it is so closely associated with the way society changed in the late 60s, in the 1970s. And that we can understand, could try and use astrology to understand it, but we can also understand it fairly simply in terms of sociology. You know, this is the baby boomers. Yeah. It's the pill. It's the discovery of cheap trips to India. You know, I mean, there's a lot of sociological stuff going on there, which does create what is indeed a new age, not in the sense that the New Ages meant new age, but in the sense that there's a big discontinuity with the old age. Which, you know, I sort of remember this. I mean, I was born in 1960, so I was too young to take part in it. But you know, I could see two different worlds out there in the streets. Looking at each other with suspicion and incomprehension. So it's associated, with the New Age. And of course, you know, I'm as a historian, a bit of a sociologist myself in some ways. I find it quite satisfying when one can look at something, an event, and one can say, okay, so here are the sociological structures. Here are the sociological causes of this, and then here are the ideas that are adopted, that find a market, that are adopted. And those ideas, not all of them, of course, but those ideas, many of them did come from the Theosophists.
Interesting prism you take into yeah. And I mean, reading all of these different personalities, because you're also, I mean, Guénon is also part of the category of Western Sufism when you study Western Sufism and modernity. But is there maybe some of your own reflections when you look at the current development of, the geopolitical situation, the global situation? Do you maybe also, do you have anything or have you diagnosed it in any way as a historian yourself who can see some repeating patterns and identifying those?
Well, I mean, as a historian, the focus of my work is on smaller things, but of course I get interested in these bigger developments as well. And we are, we're clearly at a really interesting moment here where power is shifting from one center to another center, and where so many structures that people of my generation thought were fixed forever are falling to pieces. And what's coming next is hard to see. Some people find it worrying. Some people possibly find it exhilarating. I find it fascinating.
And it is truly fascinating. I mean, if you were to ask Guénon, this is a thought experiment. If you were to ask Guénon, what's the ultimate goal of Sufism? And I'm not speaking on a merely individual level, but let's see it on a more collective, global level. I mean, in his ideal world, where should the world be heading right now?
Backwards. I mean, there's the individual level and there's the societal level. And as far as the individual level is concerned, the objective of Sufism, for Guénon, as from most philosophically minded Sufis, the object of the exercise is to return from whence we have come, the haqiqa,
self-actualization,
self-realization, etc., which in nearly all understandings means a contact, possibly a renewed contact with the transcendent. I say most Sufis because, of course, we tend sometimes to think of Sufis as all being philosophers and poets and great spiritual figures, whereas we should remember that Sufism, sociologically, is an enormous movement, an enormous group of people, and that actually, if you took all the Sufis who have ever lived, the majority of them are illiterate. Most of them are farmers.
Faqirs.
We don't really. I'm not sure. For a lot of them, the point of Sufism is to go and say hi to the local saint and have a nice anniversary celebration or something like that. But anyhow, so for Guénon, as for most intellectual Sufis, the object of the exercise is individual self-realization. In terms of social structures, well, I said earlier that Guénon wasn't political, and that is because he didn't actually believe that it was possible to restore the social structures that we have lost, because he thought modernity was too advanced. Now, this is where some of his followers disagreed with him, and that gets us the political traditionalism that people are talking a lot about today. But as far as Guénon himself was concerned, the ideal structure was a sort of idealized medieval structure where you had a priestly caste running things, setting the tone for everything, and then a warrior caste, a knightly caste running things, and then a trader caste doing its stuff in the cities, and then finally
the poets maybe at the end.
Well, no, the happy peasants, at the bottom of it all.
Okay,
and this is the ideal of a society where not where, I mean, some conservatives would say a society where everybody knows their place, but that wasn't really the point for Guénon. A society where everybody is happy in their place.
The well-being.
And I mean, not Guénon, one of his followers said that a farmer who is a good farmer is a better human being than a king who is a bad king.
Because he's actually actualized his own function.
He's actualized his own function. He's doing it properly. So that that is the ideal society for Guénon. He never thought that it was actually possible to go back to that. But we do have some people today who think that perhaps we can, in some ways, rebuild what we've lost.
I mean, that whole hierarchy reminds me of Plato's Republic, where you have also in the Islamic tradition, in what some people call the Golden Age of Islam, where Al-Medina al-Fadila, which is also written, and also when I look at Imam Khomeini. Because if Guénon was to see, I mean, is it very similar to Imam Khomeini's project, where he's the priest who's at the top of the hierarchy, the philosopher king in Plato's words? What's the connection there? I mean, have Imam Khomeini even read Guénon's works, maybe?
Okay, I mean, that's the easy question. I don't think that Imam Khomeini ever read Guénon, but we know that Ali Shariati did read Guénon. So there was a little bit of Guénon. Of course, the other thing we know at the time of the revolution was that in Iran we had Sayyid Hossein Nasr, who had certainly read Guénon backwards and forwards and inside out. And the irony that although Nasr personally was connected to the court and stood very much against the revolution.
He was a royalist.
An imperialist, I think we should now say. That his idea, his critique of modernity, had actually, in many ways, undermined the imperial system, the Shah and Shahi system, so that actually you can argue that his work contributed to the revolution, even though it was the royalists. But I mean, this is the thing about thought and politics.
Interesting turn of events. And now that I'm looking at traditionalism, I mean, I can imagine it's not all just. I mean, there must be different traditionalists, and then it's not just one category of traditionalists. And is there even a group that's called Neo-Traditionalists?
Okay. When we're talking about traditionalists, you normally have to apply an adjective of some sort, because there are other groups. I mean, if you're in Spain, or certainly if you were in Spain 70 years ago, and you talked about the traditionalists, everybody would say, oh, yes, of course, you're referring to the Carlists, aren't you? And if you're in Catholic circles and you talk about the traditionalists, people are going to say, oh, yes, of course, you're talking about the Society of Pius X and people who do the Mass in Latin. So, you have to apply an adjective. In this case, the adjective, it would be Guénonian, or perhaps perennialist, or perhaps primordial, because it does all come back to the primordial tradition. Now, what we have today is, we have a group of people who you can call neo-traditionalists and who are often called neo-traditionalists, and this is a different movement, although there are links. And the neo-traditionalists who are probably best known in the West today are people like Hamza Yusuf, and in the UK we have Abdul Hakim Winter, Abdul Hakim Murad, and these are people who want to go back to traditional Islam, by which they mean Islam before the modernists and the Ikhwan and the Islamists and all these people got into it and messed everything up. And this is a movement which we've got the Westerners, who we do call neo-traditionalists, but also we have people in the Arab world who take similar views and who are not generally referred to as traditionalists or neo-traditionalists, partly because the word traditionalist doesn't translate terribly well into Arabic. So they tend to use different terms then. Now, what these neo-traditionalists have in common with the Guénonian traditionalists is an attitude to modernity, a critique of modernity, an insistence on authenticity and authentic transmission, and also an interest in Sufism. The difference is, the fundamental difference is that Guénon, as a perennialist, thought that you could find the esoteric tradition, esoteric truth, in many different religions. Whereas today's neo-traditionalists do not refer to other religions, they focus on Islam.
So they're trying to maximize on their own tradition.
Yes, they are trying to maximize on their own tradition, and also they see their own tradition as being the final tradition. Islam is the final revelation. Once you got the final revelation, not only do you not need earlier revelations, but you shouldn't actually even go there. You should stay with your own final revelation.
It's very interesting when we look at Sufism's development, because throughout the history of Sufism, I mean, you've had people in the 12th century talking about that there is no real Sufis left, as if, it's always changing. But, I mean, in particular, since the last 150 years, I've seen that there has been a big change in the political attitude of Sufis, because some would argue that they are more quietist, as if, as opposed to the previous notion of Sufis actually being the martyrs, the warriors, the whole warrior class. We see it with Abdul Qadir. We see it with, in Libya also, revolutionary personalities there. What's colonialism effect or impact on Sufism in the last 150 years?
Yeah, well, I mean, because of people like Abdul Qadir, because a lot of the resistance to colonialism was led by Sufis, the colonial authorities were extremely suspicious of Sufis. And if you wanted to get ahead in a colonial situation, you had to reassure the authorities, which was legitimate, I think, because the primary purpose of Sufism is about the spiritual and the religious. Sufi orders are not primarily resistance organizations. They acted as resistance organizations because it seemed necessary and because nobody else was in such a good position to do it. But that is not the primary purpose of Sufism. So I think for the Sufi tariqas to say during the colonial period, okay, we're not into resistance, we're into spiritual development and stuff. I think that was completely legitimate. Not everybody thought that after the end of colonialism, and some people turned to the Sufis and said, oh, you were collaborationists, you were supporting the unjust colonial order, etc., etc. I don't myself take that view of it. But that was the impact of colonialism, that Sufis found it really useful to present themselves as quietists, as you say, as non-political. But then, of course, the next thing that happens is that we get Islamism. And
the emergence of Wahhabism and, as a British creation.
We get Wahhabism, we get Salafism, etc. And some of these movements are partly also a response to colonialism.
And a creation at the same time.
In a sense, the creation of colonialism, even,
Oh, I mean, the rivalry I'm seeing is that basically you have the Salafis in one camp, and then you have the Sufis on the other. Yeah. Whereas the Sufis, they're saying, we are actually the mainstream, we are the tradition, and you guys are just following a guy that came 600 years and claimed to be the tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you get, once you've got this second development, you get these two different groups, and it gets very, very polarized. Whereas, in fact, it's not historically, I almost said in fact, I can't really say that, but it's historically, it's not that polarized because, historically, Sufis have been very interested in following the Sharia. Sufis have been very interested in mainstream scholarship. A lot of great ulama were actually Sufis. So this sort of polarized split that we have today was not always there. But we very definitely do have that split today. And indeed, I mean, this is where the Neo-Traditionalists are saying, hold on, guys, no. Our understanding is the original one.
Everyone's trying to claim being the right group and the original group. And funny enough, I mean, the whole ironic thing is that Ibn Taymiyyah himself, who's a big champion of the Salafi movement, or he's a big character in that movement, is that he was himself part of a Sufi tariqah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he didn't. It wasn't the sense of polarization in those days. So, I mean, he didn't jump up and say, "Hey, I'm a Salafi, you're a Sufi. I'm not going to talk to you." He was saying things in different. He was using a different analytical lens completely, and he was saying, "This practice here, not sure about that." Actually, he wasn't just saying. He was saying, "This practice here, I am sure about this. It is not sunnah. You shouldn't be doing that." And of course, these are within Sufism. There have been discussions over the centuries about what practices are okay and what practices are not okay.
Orthodoxy, what's considered orthodoxy and what's not.
Well, how do we do the zikr? How do we do the hadra?
I think the last segment of this episode, I want to speak about another type of neo, and this is Neoplatonism.
Yes.
and of course, with that, I mean, the Muslim world has had, the flavor of Neoplatonism throughout its whole history, especially in the beginning. Some would even say that it was just in the air, especially in that area where you have, Alexandria, you had Egypt, you had in Iraq with Hallaj, and just the whole emanationist philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
How important is that? Also, just now we've talked about both. The traditionalist, the primordial, you have perennialism. Can you maybe, describe a little bit about Neoplatonism, emanationism,
sure. I mean,
and the connection there?
It wasn't just in the air, I'd say. It was also on paper. and this is quite important in understanding, the history of the Mediterranean world, the history of all sorts of things. The early Islamic civilization was the inheritors of Greek antiquity.
Yes.
In a way that the West wasn't. Mm-hmm. And this is a bit ironic because the modern West likes to portray itself as the inheritors of the ancient world. Mm. And I mean, it wasn't really the case. The Greek thought, especially the works of Plotinus, was translated into Arabic. Okay, I mean, translation and commentary, whatever, but we have the so-called the theology of Aristotle, as it ended up being called, which is in fact a version of the Enneads of Plotinus. So Neoplatonism was much more important in Arab philosophy than it was in early Western philosophy. And I say here Arab philosophy because many people say Islamic philosophy. Yes and no. I mean, the crucial point is that it was written in Arabic. A point some of the Arab philosophers were actually Jews. They weren't always Muslims. But the Neoplatonism is central to Arab philosophy, and the more intellectually minded Sufis were reading philosophy, and they were reading Arab philosophy. So that's how we can see Neoplatonism getting into Sufi thought in a very direct fashion. You can read the texts. You can see the terminology. You can see Ibn Arabi is using the technical, philosophical terminology of the philosophers who have used, who have found Arabic terms to translate the Greek. So, I mean, the Neoplatonism becomes central to Arab philosophy and therefore to Sufi thought. And ironically, of course, it gets back to the Europeans in Latin translations of Arab texts.
And what's the main argument for? I mean, what's their main ideas of emanationism and Neoplatonism?
Neoplatonism. The central idea is the first cause, and this I think is relatively easy to grasp because you either have a chain of causation that goes on forever, or you don't. I mean, I am talking to you because you invited me to come here, and you invited me to come here because blah, blah, blah. And
infinite regress.
Yeah. I mean, either this chain of causation goes on through eternity, or somewhere there is a first cause. And this first cause, which the Neoplatonists call the One, because if it's the cause of everything, it includes everything. And if it includes everything, you can't really say anything about it because you have to say everything about it, and you can't say anything about everything. So this is why we end up calling it the One,
the monad.
Yeah, and this, in some ways, you refer to haqiqa. In practice, haqiqa is an Arab label for the One. I mean, it's a word which means other things as well, of course, but in many contexts, it's an Arab label for this One. So everything comes from the One. We come from the One. This microphones comes from the One. More importantly, my spirit comes from the One. So the question facing every person is whether their spirit should turn towards the One where it came from, or turn towards this world where the spirit is, in a sense, imprisoned. And we have that choice. Actually, from a Sufi perspective, it's not a binary choice. There are three options. One of them is we can go completely for this world and spend our time eating and drinking beer and
hedonism,
hedonism. The opposite of that is to follow the Sufi path, to try and find the way back to the haqiqa. But there is an easy choice in the middle, and that is simply to follow exoteric Islam, to follow the Sharia, which is a lot easier as a path. And that, of course, is one of the important things about Sufism, also for Guénon, which is that it is a difficult path. It's not a path for everybody. It's a path for those who want to try it. And if you don't try it, that's cool. That's no problem. Follow the Sharia, and you will, with God's mercy, end up in paradise. And that's okay. That's for most people. So if we take our three choices, you've got a few people who are simply focusing on this manifestation, and you've got a few people who are going straight for the ultimate, and you've got a lot of people in the middle, which is fine.
And it requires, Guénon saying that it's very hard is because it requires an ego death, where you actually try to connect with the transcendent. And this is where it gets hard, because for most people, we have all these attachments to the material, and it's very hard to actually purify oneself. But the ultimate goal of Sufism is that you reach this state where there is no existence but God. La mawjood illallah, as they say in Arabic. And this is where Mulla Sadra is a very interesting figure, because he also tried to reconfigure both Shia Irfan with the Sufis and made his own formulation. And funny enough, his school is called the Theosophical Transcendence, which is also interesting when we look at the Theosophical Society. And he also understood that essentially the transcendent is equals existence, and you have the necessary existence, and all of us are contingent, and we all are, have brought or have, the emanation idea that we are actually a manifestation of God's attributes on earth, and essentially we need to return refuge back to the source.
Which is a very Neoplatonic understanding, and is a lot more rigorous than Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society. we must say. I'm not sure whether Guénon knew of Mulla Sadra. But some of the people who know Mulla Sadra today have also read Guénon.
Yeah.
So there's a productive intersection there.
It's a funny web. I mean, speaking now that I'm looking at the whole red thread, I mean, we have the modernity, and then we have Sufism, Western Sufism with Guénon, and you have Neoplatonism also being, you can see the fragrance of it in all these, in Sufism. You have it in Guénon's work and the whole tradition, the primordial tradition. And that's just me summing up everything we've spoken about in today's session.
Quite a lot, actually. Yeah.
I want to say, Mark, thank you very much for joining us here and accepting our invitation. And it's been such a pleasure. CD, Mark.
Thank you very much indeed. It's always a pleasure to talk about my favorite subjects with people who are also interested in them. So thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.